Build my home on hollow ground. Too proud to grow.
This is Craig Smith with Eye on AI, a podcast about artificial intelligence. There's a race underway between the world's great powers to integrate machine learning into their national security infrastructure and to develop artificial intelligence-powered defense capabilities. This week, I talked to Brendan McCord, who wrote the Pentagon's AI strategy and is now a special government employee at the National Security Commission on AI. Brendan talks about what he believes the U.S. needs to do to stay competitive with China and to promote an alternative vision of AI-powered security and prosperity to the world. I hope you find Brendan's ideas as thought-provoking as I did.
Cross it to find your synthetic light.
Okay, so let's start with who you are, your education, and how you got interested in AI for national security or national security as it relates to AI.
Great. Well, first, thank you for having me. I'm Brendan McCord, and how I came to work at this intersection of AI and national security is that 3 or 4 years ago, I sat in an audience and I heard then Secretary Ash Carter talk about the Department of Defense being at an inflection point when it came to AI. And as I sat there, I was bringing with me a mix of engineering education from MIT, entrepreneurial education from Harvard Business School, and experiences first in the operational military, having spent over 600 days underwater on submarine missions at the forward edge of the military, and then in leading a team of AI experts and software engineers at a startup that was applying AI to public safety challenges. So as I sat in the audience, I heard Secretary Carter's statements as a clarion call for me to join the department and work on that mission. I joined the Defense Innovation Unit, which is based out here in Silicon Valley, as a technical appointee, as head of machine learning. And I worked there first on really interesting open source projects, built big data sets, pursued world speed records for training deep neural nets on public infrastructure. And that gave way to solution building type things. So then I helped manage the Google effort within Project Maven and also helped to apply an interesting non-deep learning, imperfect information game solving AI to a military planning challenge. Ultimately, though, as we built momentum, that role gave way to strategy development and to the formation of a new team in the Department of Defense called the Joint AI Center. So the end result, as I look back, and I'll say that here that these are my personal views, not the views of the Department of Defense or the government. But as I look back, it was a front row seat on history. And to some degree, I got to see this pivotal point of an AI-focused transformation of what is one of the largest and most complex and most entrenched bureaucracies in the world, but one with an absolutely crucial mission. I'm now at a company called Talco, and I work with billionaire entrepreneur Thomas Tull and with a wonderful team of data scientists and machine learning experts there. Our mission is to transform sleepy parts of the economy, and we're an alternative investment platform built as a holding company, and we work in sectors like medical apparel and security, waste management, and other areas. Our model is to partner with challenger companies that are led by bold entrepreneurs who want to go and take these static sectors on, and they use advanced technologies and the business models that they enable. Our AI lab helps them do that with a partnership model. We help them accelerate and compete and win.
Wow. Okay. That's quite a lot. So you left DoD what year?
Earlier this year.
Okay. And I've seen you referred to as the architect of the DoD's AI strategy. And I wonder what exactly that means and how did that come about?
To frame the strategy, I'll start with a historical lens. For the past 5 decades or so, DoD's focus on AI, and it was focused on AI, was on enabling risky discovery and on fostering technology creation through early stage basic research. And we viewed AI as a research concern almost entirely. The work that was done there historically was nothing short of visionary. If you think about the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, or DARPA, their work in perception and natural language and planning, and many other areas, and the partnership they helped build among the government, academia, and industry led to what is now personal assistance and near natural prosthetics and self-driving cars. So to say that the work that was done transformed technological practice would be to really understate the case. It transformed the world.
Yeah.
But I mentioned that we were at an inflection point in my time in government. What we realized was that we now had to translate the technology, translate AI into decisions and impact, and had to do that at the speed of technological advancement and at the scale of the entire national security enterprise. So we created a strategy to do that. I'll talk about three aspects of the strategy. First, much of the insight from the DoD strategy is actually around the art of organization.
Yeah.
We had over 600 active AI projects in AI, and each one of these projects was globally unique in the software sense, from how the data was managed to the development, to how things were fielded, to how the technologies were acquired, every dimension. So this incredibly complex and slow and costly process. And to go from that to a coherent enterprise approach in which decentralized projects can flourish, but on top of a common foundation, was one key aim. Second, how do you deliver quickly into operations? I believe that you use essentially the approach that's been followed here in Silicon Valley and been used in decades past in national security. You have a small team, you give them a specific problem to solve, you prioritize shipment date, you work directly with your end users, you start small, you field, you iterate, and then you scale until eventually the entire mission area is transformed. So there's a lot of common sense in that approach. The third thing I'll mention from the strategy is around leading in military ethics and AI safety. One of the clearest statements that you see in the strategy is that as the department moves out, its focus will include ethics and humanitarian considerations, and this notion of short and long-term AI safety.
Yeah, and then out of that strategy came the JAIC, is that right?
That's correct. The Joint AI Center, or JAIC, is the department's new AI Center of Excellence. And its mission is to work across the entire department, across the services and across DoD, to transform the department by accelerating the delivery and adoption of AI to achieve mission impact at scale.
So part of the challenge for you was mapping all of these 600 projects, understanding how they fit together in an overarching strategy, and then to create an entity that could coordinate among them. Is that right?
Part of the challenge was, as you mentioned, to prioritize and to create coherence. And one of the ways that we attacked the prioritization was to name a small number of so-called national mission initiatives. These are big problems, big mission areas that are ambitious in their scope. And examples include a national mission initiative for humanitarian assistance and disaster relief, one for predictive maintenance to change the way we maintain our equipment wholesale in the Department of Defense. And rather than having small hobby projects, so to speak, these are very large efforts of a certain structure that are designed to both really change that mission area and also to progressively build out this common foundation so that projects thereafter can flourish on top of it in a highly decentralized way. Without having this initial wave of more centralized projects, it's difficult to put that decentralized model in place.
There's been a lot of criticism in the press by people that look at national strategies across the world who say that the U.S. does not have a well-defined strategy in the way that China has or Russia has or even France has. Do you think that's true? And because I was talking to Trey Stevens and Brian Schimpf from a company called Anduril. I'm sure you know them. And one of them made the point that particularly with China and Russia, their economies and their political systems are structured in a very different way. So having a centralized strategy makes sense, whereas the U.S. is by nature decentralized. And so maybe having a centralized strategy isn't as important. I'm just curious what you think about that.
Well, I think good progress has been made initially on military intelligence side of the equation in the United States. And while I think we're starting to solve for the key variables of speed and organizational change, I do think those were the principal challenges that we faced. I think more needs to be done at the national level.
More in terms of funding or in terms of organization?
In terms of strategy, in terms of national strategy and committing as a country to resolving and dealing with the opportunities and challenges that AI poses. Broadly speaking, I've heard those broken into three camps. I'd say one is around military and intelligence effectiveness and the revolution that's occurring there. The second is around economic competitiveness, which includes things like technological job displacement. And the third is around the future of democracy, which includes many, many things, but certainly individual freedoms that are affected by AI systems that are fair, accountable, transparent, and ethical in operation. So those three different aims around the military, economy, and democracy are all things that have to be dealt with in the United States in the context of our Western democracy. I think much more needs to be done in regard to those things at the national level, particularly outside of the military and intelligence arena. And just to give you some examples, I think if the U.S. were to proceed boldly there and make resource commitments for dealing with those challenges and political commitments for dealing with those things, I'd want to do a handful of things. One, I'd want to attack the entry barriers to progress. And this starts by focusing on increasing the supply of skilled AI professionals. The single most significant entry barrier in this country and around the world is the scarcity of talent. You could increase the number of U.S. computer science students by a factor of 3 or 5 in the next several years. You could also, with about $1 billion a year of funding, I believe, incentivize our companies to build the workforce needed for the future and incentivize them with a tax credit, for example. You could also better harness the gift of global talent with new pathways for very high skilled talent from China and from elsewhere to live and work in the United States. And then on talent, you could also expand the discipline with efforts aimed at diversity and inclusion. So that's one area, human capital. Another type of entry barrier in AI is data and the physical infrastructure of AI. If you scale up access to the infrastructure for innovation, you allow academia to flourish and you let new firms better compete with incumbents, particularly large incumbents. Just as an example here, imagine an American cloud credit where there's a free market credit-based approach to accessing those crucial resources. The government also has a huge role to play on data, both in unlocking existing data through things like privacy preserving AI or improvements to interoperability or resolving copyright issues. It also has a huge role to play in provisioning new data sets that maybe never would have existed, tipping the scale on data that never would have existed in the world. Satellite imagery is a great example of this, which of course led to a revolution in mapping and many other innovations. To foster the sharing of data, which is a key attribute, you could charge universities in the United States with acting as a network of data brokers. Other areas beyond those crucial entry barriers of talent, data, and compute are what I think of as AI for X. And this is really inspired by some of the work that people like Tom Khalil have done or what they're doing at MIT with the new College of Computing. Mm-hmm. But examples are AI for scientific discovery, applying it to things like material science or chemistry, or for a more practical action standpoint, AI for X could mean AI for global public goods like humanitarian assistance and disaster relief or healthy longevity. Imagine if you had longitudinal healthcare data from DoD and from the VA and from TRICARE. You'd have an incredible opportunity there. An additional element of any plan is transformative R&D. And I do think the administration is focusing on that of late. DARPA has a third wave of AI that they believe is important. And I double down on that class of work to try to give these systems contextual reasoning and address the limitations of today's technology. Also in the R&D realm, going beyond Moore's law with quantum computing or neuromorphic computing or other things is also important, as is exploring how AI systems interact with institutions or the labor market. So that's R&D broadly. I'd also include protecting the American worker as a critical part in any bold AI plan in the United States. You can use things like employer-side subsidies or the earned income tax credit expansion to try to create a more dynamic and resilient workforce. Eric Brynjolfsson is a great thinker on this subject, and there are several others, but essentially this allows us to hedge against a wide range of future scenarios. It allows people to try to seek out work, and it lowers the risk of hiring. And importantly, it also maintains standard of living. There's a need for optimism in the workforce, and I think you can cultivate that through reskilling and lifelong learning and fair income sharing policies. And then again, we need to, at the national level, greatly stimulate the development of AI that is ethical and safe. So that's another major area for national strategy. We've certainly continued in that direction in the department through the new AI strategy, but systems should clearly reflect the U.S. values of freedom and the guarantee of human rights, the rule of law, the stability of institutions, the right to privacy, and so forth. And we should promote AI standards to do this, but we should also consider increasing the actual market demand for systems that have these beneficial properties, that have ethical and safe properties. I'd love it if we took a page from the playbook of clean energy and used the government's purchasing power to try to spur widespread deployment of systems that have these properties. I think of fair lending systems or accountable facial recognition or interpretable criminal justice AI.
Yeah.
These are all areas where the government operates and can play a huge role.
Well, you've mentioned a pretty broad spectrum there. Does all of that, in your view, fall under national security, or is national security just one part of this broader AI strategy that the U.S. should pursue?
I think it's one part, but I think the largest gap is actually not in the national security realm.
In the economic realm or the educational realm or political?
I think it's in the economic competitiveness, and I think it's in the future of democracy. So it encompasses those things. If these were the two categories of three, with the third being more the national security one, the military and intelligence one, I believe that with recent effort in the department and with the significant treasure that we allocate to this, though I'm critical of how we allocate it, there's a lot of momentum there. With the stand-up of the National Security Commission on AI, for example, you have brilliant minds around the problem thinking about that part of the issue and actively launching this 2-year tour to really look at where we should go. So I think the area for progress, the biggest gap, is really around economic competitiveness and ensuring the future of democracy.
The gap between where we should be and where we are, or the gap between the goals and what our potential adversaries are doing?
Both. The way I'd say it is that the potential adversary, the strategic competitor, for example, China, is clearly the example brought up in the episode with Trey and Brian. China is using the technology to deepen their grip internally on their populace and to undermine basic human rights in some cases. Additionally, they're using it to spread illiberal practices beyond their borders and to erode public trust in open societies generally, or at least to pose the risk of that. And I think that's deeply concerning. But the main focus that I have is actually less around what China can do and is doing. It's more on what the US is not doing and on the vacuum between the two. And I believe that a number of steps that we've taken recently as a country have been only peripherally relevant to that and haven't addressed the lack of progress in the United States and have essentially done nothing to close the vacuum. In some cases, they've even worsened it.
Yeah. Just on the commission, the National Security Commission on AI, how does their mandate fit in with this in plugging these holes? Is it broad enough to cover the economic competitiveness or the fostering or protecting Western-style democracy, or are they really limited to the military piece?
This group has individuals on it who are certainly thinking about the biggest picture possible. It's chaired by Eric Schmidt and Bob Work, and it's composed of luminaries in relevant fields. And these are folks who are concerned with the biggest questions around the future of techno-democracy versus techno-authoritarianism and so forth. So I think they are operating in the solution space of national security topics, and their recommendations will naturally hew to that mandate, but they do understand the linkages to the bigger questions. The way Congress structured that group in its charter is they allowed for the pursuit of other topics as necessary.
Yeah.
But I know that the National Security Commission on AI will work with the right actors, with the intergovernmental or interagency actors, and with the White House to find the right demarcations there.
Yeah. When you look at the U.S. compared to China and Russia, who are presumably the top two competitors in this dimension, how does the U.S. stack up against those two countries? Do you have a sense of that?
On China, I reflect that earlier this year, I was in several countries in Southeast Asia. I traveled there with U.S. Special Operations Forces, and it was a trip that was taken with some senior venture investors and AI experts, and was to advise the head of SOCOM, Special Operations Command, on steps to take going forward in light of the changes in emerging technology, particularly AI. So very much going to the forward edge, to the jungles of the Philippines, into areas in remote parts of Thailand and so forth. And what I observed there, being in the region, was a couple of things. One is that China was exceptionally savvy about their public perception and their influence in the region. There were events days prior. There was a bombing at a place called Holo Church in southern Philippines. And months before that, there was a Thai cave rescue that was globally publicized. So we talked to individuals on the U.S. side in the Special Operations Command who had been involved in both of those things on the ground. Folks who had come down to help with mission planning, or were actually there in the rescue or aftermath, trying to do what they could do to save lives in the case of the bombing. What I would say is that although the U.S. has a sustained presence there and played a significant role in support effort, and although in the case of the Philippines, the U.S. contributes over $100 million, I think, in development assistance and over $100 million in military aid every year, and is literally helping fight ISIS-P in the jungle today in southern Philippines in a supporting way, the Chinese involvement there was capitalized on expertly for the purpose of influence in a very significant way. So the Chinese contribution of about, I think, $700,000 to families in the Holo Church bombing was pushed out on social media in a way that showed a level of sophistication around the PR side of things.
Yeah.
In both cases, the Pentagon downplayed the role, and I admire that, frankly, and that's not the point that I'm trying to make. But public opinion, influenced by these operations and by shifting statements or shifts in policy and so forth, leaves the people there with difficulty judging whether our nation is good or bad, whether our societal model is good or bad, relatively speaking. Another thing I noticed that we talked about is the strategic character of investment and the industrial penetration of China. One example that made the press a few days ago was in Uganda, where Huawei helped to support spying. And that general exportation of a surveillance stack is very problematic in many regions around the world. It's not so much an investment or a transfer of capital or business transaction. It's a seizure of power. And there, not only is China assuming a major role in strategic areas of development in Africa and other countries, they're also exporting that model at a fairly rapid rate. So it's a textbook operation that's very important to follow. My point in giving those examples is that there are macro strategies that are available to China around strategic investment, influence, development. And if this is a playing field, then when you're at the level of an individual military unit, like the ones I was with, you miss that macro effect almost entirely. You're the parable of the blind men and the elephant, and you're staring at a portion of this elephant while this macro strategy is unfolding around the globe. So we need to look and ask ourselves the question of whether we're organized to see those things and to counter them.
In terms of spending, because developing a strategy in the way you're talking about requires ultimately putting dollars down. What kind of spending is required, and is the awareness of the U.S. Congress such that they're likely to put that money down?
I would urge thinking on the order of several tens of billions or $100 billion over the course of the next, say, 5 years. And I say that because thinking through this in a bottom-up sense and thinking about what are the lines of effort and the orders of magnitude for those, how does it bubble up, but also thinking about reference points around significant mega projects in the past. Certainly our way forward would be composed of mega projects and other spending, non-mega project spending. But to give a reference, the Manhattan Project alone was $2 billion in yesteryear dollars, and that's about $30 billion today on one well-coordinated project. I think there are lots of different components of what we need to do that would total around $100 billion. I'll also say, though, that resourcing inside of the federal government, particularly in the area of defense, is not meager today. Yeah. It's just distributed badly in some cases. And what I mean by that is that many parts of the Department of Defense are a drag on progress, and they're in fact doomed by technological change. They don't line up with the National Defense Strategy, but they continue to be subsidized and developed. I think that maybe 70%, and folks will have to check this figure, but 70% of the budget of the Air Force, for example, fits into this category of sustainment. And they're trying very aggressively to shift that under Will Roper. But, in major paradigm shifts, I think of Europe in the 1960s during the space race, you had countries like France spending their treasure to subsidize their coal industry or their agriculture and not competing in innovation, not competing for outer space in the way that they could have. And if a fraction of those subsidies to the past had been devoted to research or to technology delivery, they could have greatly improved in areas of work where innovation was crucial. So I think there's a question around how do you ensure continued competitiveness? And at the national level, I think that's on the order of magnitude of $100 billion. And then I think there's a question of how does the department look at its existing resources and reallocate to avoid these subsidies?
Yeah. You keep referring to the department, but is that the right structure to do this? Does the U.S. need a new department, an AI department, where the money is concentrated and allocated and coordinated instead of through the Department of Defense or spread out among multiple organizations and initiatives that may not be well coordinated?
There's one perspective that the existing agencies in government already cover down on the problems we face, and relatively little needs to be done intergovernmentally or at the interstices of those agencies. I don't hold that view, and I think there are problems that we miss almost entirely by focusing on only the agency structure. I think there are good reasons why you have these integrative groups like the National Security Council or the Office of Science and Technology Policy in the White House. There's another view that says that this is solved principally through a new effort, through a new Sandia National Lab for AI type of thing. And I think there's a middle ground where there are incredibly important roles for existing agencies. DARPA focusing on the third wave of AI, for example, the National Science Foundation applying AI to materials science that are along the lines of effort that I spoke about. But I do think there's a role for a new structure. In order to ensure sound stewardship, you want to have, if for no other reason, a way to bring the best brains to the problem.
Yeah.
So having an organization, call it the American AI Institute, for example, that brings together these leaders in the public sector with world-leading academics and businesses and philanthropists in a very flexible, modern structure that allows them to coordinate closely with the leading centers around the globe. It's sort of the Silicon Valley management truism that Keith Raboy talks about. You have to get the right people around the problem, even if it breaks your org chart.
Yeah.
And so in some sense, the National Security Commission on AI is very, very encouraging in that regard, because if for nothing else, it is succeeding in getting brilliant people around the problem. I think it makes a lot of sense to have a structure like an American AI Institute that gives advice back to government, conducts its own research, and does these interfacing roles across society.
You use the number $100 billion over 5 years. Would an institute like that be the organization to spend that effectively so that the money would be allocated to a central authority that's peopled by the kinds of people you're talking about, who would then coordinate the spending of that money and the prioritization that you talked about?
To get started, you'd likely want to plus up an existing agency by several hundred people or thousands of people over the course of 5 years. And I do think for coherence that you'd be best off managing that in one structure, that coordination. You would end up then having other agencies be the means by which you execute those dollars. But yes.
Can you give in broad strokes where you think $100 billion in 5 years could be spent effectively?
Yes, I'll give some specifics. I talked about one goal being increasing the supply of skilled AI professionals, the talent piece. So to fund a talent pipeline that triples the current number of U.S. citizen grad students in computer science, you could give them $25,000 a year, each student. You could do that by adding roughly $1 billion a year to the Department of Education or to the National Science Foundation, and you could cultivate this huge group of new high-skilled domestic talent. That's one example. You could also address that corporate underinvestment in worker training in AI through about $1 billion a year with IRS and Treasury by having a tax deduction for AI worker training within U.S. companies. Other examples we spoke about are around the access to infrastructure, this American cloud credit that allows for critical computational resources to be allocated in a free market credit-based way. If you had $10,000 per student per year, and I know that faculty needs this as well, but it's a big burden on them that their students do, that'd be about $1 billion, and it would have ideas get decoupled from hardware constraints in the economy. Other examples are for on the order of 100 million per year. You could stimulate progress in cyber physical systems with shared national test beds. Imagine if you had a national robotics test bed that could be accessed anywhere, around the world, or if you had test sites to integrate drones into U.S. airspace or autonomous greenhouses. These are things that big companies can do today. A self-driving car test track on a military base. These are things big internet companies can do, but they're major barrier to most. Yeah. And people want the government to be involved with administering those types of things because it builds technical competency. It creates information for policymakers.
Yeah.
I think we could do that for a reasonable amount of money. When you talk about applying AI to global problem solving, there is almost no end to the inspirational and daunting tasks you could apply it to. I've talked about humanitarian assistance and disaster relief, but there are so many we could formulate. I've recently seen this collaboration between Triple AS and Schmidt Futures, a catalog called the Moonshot Catalog with these types of problems. On spending, basic research is expensive. Going beyond Moore's Law, you could easily imagine quantum computing and neuromorphic computing being well over $1 billion a year from the government.
Yeah.
I'll also say that when we talk about using government purchasing power to promote the development of AI that's ethical and safe across many applications, for $400 million or $500 million per year, government purchasing power could start to fill in the market with many different systems that have these beneficial properties in areas where the government plays, like the safe aviation software that we need, or criminal justice AI, or fair lending systems. Even broader than that, I think a huge portion of this spending would go towards the workforce. You have real uncertainty around the range of future scenarios. For one, the economic benefits could go to those at the top who own the robots, or there could be positive scenarios where wealth gets distributed effectively across low, medium, and high earners. Or there are scenarios that are bimodal or different combinations of those things. We just don't know. The earned income tax credit is actually an elegant way, I believe, to deal with those things. You could wind it down or you could spin it up to be able to manage these scenarios and maintain standards of living. So that's probably $1.5 billion per year to have some efficacy there, and would be important, potentially crucially important in the coming years. Those are just some examples. I'll throw out one that doesn't have a big number associated with it, but is important, which is fostering beneficial alliances and partnerships. There would be a huge return on investment here. Strengthening U.S. capacity to set global standards and to establish an international economic and security architecture is easy to underinvest in. And if you have one human being who's focused on that task in a Department of Defense, it just won't get done.
Yeah.
If you staff these emerging technology policy teams and you organize them appropriately for small dollars, they can help bring together these allies and partners.
Yeah. What about data? Because the bottleneck right now is not really so much in the basic research as it is in finding data pools large enough to test and train systems on. Could the U.S. play a role in pooling data or breaking down silos? And in some of the government collected data that's not accessible right now, making that accessible?
Absolutely. And I think in a few different ways. One is by unlocking data that exists already in the public sector, federal, state, and local governments, in places like healthcare institutions as well. And how do you unlock that existing data and use it to create high quality training data, for example? Well, for one, you could add data engineering resources to government, humans that know how to do that sort of thing, which is lacking today. Additionally, you have research and pilots and standards in the areas of, broadly speaking, privacy preserving AI. This happens to be something that I think is really well aligned with our societal model and would help unlock existing data. Federated machine learning is one example of a technology that would be beneficial here and could be applied more broadly in contexts such as healthcare. On the existing data question, IP and copyright language is another area where governments could help resolve gray areas associated with using data on the internet. So that's existing data. On the other side, there is new data, and it's very transformative to have the government leverage its unique ability to create these new data sets and the jobs that go along with them, because frankly, it's a human intensive task most of the time. This data can catalyze new industries. It can spur new breakthroughs. Examples are vehicle crash data or brain imaging data. And we can bring about the creation of the data in a way that very much broadens accessibility to it. The third piece, I think, is having the United States and universities in particular help make the data available, prepare it, and make it available. Imagine you have a network of US universities that are operating as data brokers and are helping through government funding to coordinate the identification of data that's relevant to the problems at hand on the frontier, which is constantly changing. The data changes as a function of where the technology is at that moment. They're helping with the collection, with transformation and sharing of it. UK biobanks effort is a good example of this, done in a narrow context in the UK. But I think universities would love to be enlisted in that effort. And I could imagine $300 million a year going to Department of Education or NSF to establish that brokerage network and take some load off of the government, which frankly isn't equipped to do it very well.
Yeah. Yeah, we talked briefly before we started about whether addressing climate change with machine learning fits into this. And regardless of your view on whether climate change is man-made or natural, I don't think anyone argues that there's no global warming. AI and machine learning can certainly help address that. Do you see that falling within the government mandate, specifically the national security mandate?
So I think with climate change, there are near-term harms that fall into the national security realm. Examples are impacts to refugee flows or the creation of unlivable areas or infectious disease spread or extreme weather events in parts of the world. Arctic passages, I think back to my time on submarines, could open up and that could change the national security calculus in northern regions. But the major costs of climate change for national security or otherwise are still probably several decades away. I think casting it onto the national security landscape, while accurate to a degree, is sometimes done to make political coordination more likely or to make it reach those people who might not be persuaded by the scientific argument alone. And that is frustrating to me because I think the meta point is that national security isn't the only vector for progress or for coordination, for resourcing. Climate change is an issue irrespective of its national security implication. I think there's a large chunk of humanity that has the audacity and determination and ingenuity to go work on this at a massive scale where political coordination has failed. This is an area where I would love to see large-scale effort to catalyze progress and even to bring about the kind of coordination that's needed from the government to get it to do its part. I think we can pull government into this one by starting something large. And that doesn't solve necessarily for the deficit of coordination that's necessary or rather present in some global public goods issues beyond climate change. It also doesn't solve for this anti-science sentiment that is present in some ways in government. To some degree, I think we risk having banners flying and drums beating and marching backward, as they say in Inherit the Wind about evolution, when we talk about climate change and ignore the science.
Yeah, it's just if it were put under the national security umbrella, it would get the funding that's needed for this group of people, as you say, that can see that machine learning can have an impact. Whereas if it's left to a loose coordination of NGOs and academic institutions outside of government, it's never going to get the kind of funding that it needs.
In the current political context, that may be the case. I think there are real needs for funding around the issues I mentioned, climate change impact to national security I mentioned, but the idea of that you can only go at it from the national security lens is deeply problematic. It's an example of an effort that the US government writ large could play a leadership role in, and it goes way beyond national security because the issue goes way beyond national security.
Yeah, I agree. It's just that it's not happening. And since there is this focus in the last year on coordinating and funding artificial intelligence research and development at a national level, it seems like an opportunity then to get money into that area. It's not just national security, it's critical for humanity, of course. So $100 billion over 5 years, you've given an outline of how that might be spent. Would that kind of funding properly allocated keep us competitive with China, given the amount of resources that China is throwing at the problem?
The areas that I mentioned, I think, would help make immense progress. The way I'll answer the question, though, is separate from the resource question specifically. I think beyond spending on economic competitiveness and shoring up threats to democracy, one piece that's missing is one of the reasons the U.S. was very successful in the period from the Cold War to the first Sputnik. there was this special combination of forces and special fusion of talent across government and the private sector and academia that created immense dynamism and progress. We need to, again, find the right units adapted to current conditions that help us organize and compete here.
Yeah. Is Russia a competitor in this field, a credible competitor, or is it really a lot of bluster from them?
The trend I'm most concerned about with when we talk about Russia is that we are heading towards a highly networked world. And you add AI to this networked digital domain, and everything can be made convincingly synthetic, and proliferation of information is the default. So I think this has huge potential to disrupt democratic and undemocratic societies alike. I think Russia seems ready to, as a matter of strategy, to seize upon the age of institutionalized fake news and of deep fakes and so forth on social media. So that could be disruptive in a whole range of dimensions, certainly to politics, also to financial markets. Big impact there. Neil Ferguson writes well about this with respect to the concern that the giant network platforms, the internet platforms, have created a much less stable public sphere. So the fake news and extreme views get proliferated in these contexts, both intentionally and because of the business models and the algorithms. So I think Russia is very problematic there, had a big role in creating a decisive outcome in the election of the last president. And I think going forward, there are many more intended consequences from Russia and unintended consequences as well with that dynamic.
Yeah. You talked about the need to increase the flow of qualified researchers into the U.S. from abroad. And there's been this trend that I think is dangerous of suspicion and resistance toward accepting more, particularly Chinese researchers and engineers and students in this space. I think it's dangerous because you start pulling that apart, it hardens positions on either side. Whereas while there are obviously risks in that flow of information back and forth, it tends to bind countries together. How do you feel about that?
Well, clearly that flow can be used for coercive gain, but I think the entanglement or the economic interdependence does tend to bind us together in a way that promotes stability. I think also that Chinese investment activity and human capital is part of your question as well, but the investment activity tends to help because it increases the efficiency of our businesses and our production. I think that's been true going back to Alexander Hamilton. That's been a principle of how we think about foreign investment in the US. But on that question of the gift of global talent, Chinese and otherwise, maybe especially Chinese given their position in AI, it is clearly ours to lose.
Yeah.
It's an immense loss to have these brilliant minds not sticking around after their PhD or going back to China. I think about the quote of the Russian grand designer in The Right Stuff, which is, our Germans have to be better than their Germans.
Yeah.
And it's kind of a funny phrase, but it gets to this point of, if we can have a country that's the magnet for global talent, this is a very special property indeed. To your point that with the protection style thinking, it either tends to be relevant to the problem or deal with it peripherally. The problem is not what China can do, but what the US cannot do and what the vacuum is between the two.
Yeah.
So, it's a problem of forward progress. And it's you either have these misguided or peripheral actions, or in some cases, jingoistic actions that lead to a bad distinction between the PLA and the Chinese national who's doing a PhD program in the United States. That said, I will say that there's a lot you could talk about with Chinese technology transfer and IP theft. There's a lot that's been written about by people like Mike Brown from the Defense Innovation Unit and uncovered there. And there is more transparency and information that needs to surface on that. For example, if someone from the PLA applied 3 or 5 times under different names to work at a big tech company, I would hope that there are channels to be able to share that, short of calling Sundar and Satya and Mark and Jeff to testify in front of Congress.
Yeah.
That is a real concern. And I think companies sometimes don't feel like they have a channel for sharing it.
Yeah, that's interesting. One of the advantages that China has is this closeness between the government, the military, and industry. There are really no walls there. The U.S. has to fight a public relations battle in order to work openly with industry on certain projects. Project Maven is a perfect example. Do you think it's overstating to say that the U.S. is hobbled by that?
I think people forget that historically, before the Cold War and this first Sputnik period that we talked about, not only was business separate from government, but it was constantly struggling with it. There was a chasm between intellectuals and businessmen and these rifts in society. And this remarkable change happened where we started to fuse our talents, create a joint techno structure, like an integrated entity. And I think that model worked well for several decades. I think we need a new model, a new form of organization that's adapted to current conditions. And we certainly haven't found it yet. So I think we're today in a spot needing to figure that out, that collaboration, that depth of collaboration there. But I think that's our charge. And with Project Maven, we took steps forward and steps backward on that question. But that is our challenge.
Yeah. But you don't see it as a particular problem right now?
I do. Insofar as the core challenge is to find that new structure to work together. I'm just optimistic that we can do it. And I think we can do it based on inspiration and based on being called forward to solve problems that are important, and not just based on, or not at all based on compelling businesses to do so. I think we can do it through the combination of capital market mechanisms, the government wielding its purchasing power and being a monopsony or the single customer in some areas, and then also through inspiration based on values. People are ready for that, and we haven't done a good enough job in inspiring them for some of these important missions.
Yeah. You talked about China exporting its surveillance technology to strengthen authoritarian governments or governments that are client states of China or governments that emulate the Chinese model. How does the U.S. counter that? Trey Stevens said something to the effect of the U.S. not having stepped up with leadership, but I'm not sure how you step up with leadership through standards and that sort of thing.
You can export a different stack for one. And I think there's really exciting work happening in privacy preserving AI, federated machine learning, and other areas that could be proliferated to make for privacy preserving and value aligned systems. There could be a real large Western effort to do so. I also think back to the Android model of a free OS that was so good and so useful and so ubiquitous that it reduced the utility of all other non-compliant systems. That, for example, in this case, non-compliant could be things that lack off switches or ethics libraries or things like that. So there are interesting head-to-head stacks or standards that we could promote. Another thing is, of course, you can lead in standard setting. And the government has started to engage there, but we can engage in and shape the process, the global process more. And we can also lead in setting some of our own at home. So on paper, set standards that are world leading in ethics and safety. But I basically think that those are the areas we go with. Then there's also an interesting counter to the stack of technologies that's focused on the surveillance use case and controlling populations. And that's to do something very different and to have a much more inspirational set of technologies that you work with other countries to develop. An example is around humanitarian assistance and disaster relief. Imagine if we had a support and response system for the world in times of disaster, like fires or flooding or hurricane or earthquake, that the U.S. helped bring into being and worked with academics and companies around the world to shape. I'd find that incredibly motivating. And it would be a way to mobilize whole governments and whole societies to do some of these things we want to do. Frankly, would be a much better way of promoting our value system in countering the techno-authoritarian stack.
How much of a threat do you see China as in this regard? I mean, is there a danger that China will get ahead in spreading technology and with it its government model or ideology globally if the U.S. doesn't step in to counter that?
Yes, absolutely. There was a French writer who talked about the rise of America and the impact of American industry and technology and culture on Europe in the 1960s. He wrote a book called The American Challenge. And in it, he argued that here we are in Europe, we're more prosperous than ever, but we're slipping behind in this push for technological progress. And we need to galvanize our forces to confront that challenge. Europe did not succeed in doing that. They did not work out a coherent strategy. They could unite different factions. And they had their outmoded institutions and entrenched privileges and outdated techniques that hampered them. So they missed the greatest industrial adventure of all time in the space race. America left Europe in the dust. And I think if we look at the speed and power and pervasiveness of Chinese investments and activities in AI, they are a warning to us all around what kind of future do we want. So I think we have to remaster the art of organization and mobilize people to build this future. But absolutely, I think we can do it.
Other than Russia and China, who do you see as the next competitor in line?
Well, the National Defense Strategy outlines a couple of other nations. Iran and North Korea clearly come to mind. But I would also say that with AI in particular, there is a change in the economics of power, or the ability to scale an ensemble of self, so to speak. And so the AI version of an Osama bin Laden, where a nation state was going up against an individual in some ways, that is a very real possibility, given that this individual could distribute their impact across the global economy and wreak havoc through multiple threat vectors. So maybe it's a nation state, but maybe it's not. I know that military thinkers are grappling with that possibility as well.
Yeah. This focus that's come about in the last year or so, where do you think the U.S. will be in 5 years? Do you think that there will be a robust, coordinated, well-funded national strategy, or do you think it's going to take longer than that?
I think there will be. For all the critique that I shared in this conversation, I think there is a real chance at bold progress and in proceeding in what David Ignatius called in the Washington Post the American way, which is not about the national geography, but about a set of values that really came out of the Enlightenment. And I think using our economy, our vibrant economy, to help resource our plans, I think we can get there. I think there's a huge amount of organizational work that needs to be done. And there are people who are currently at the periphery of this who will need to get more involved from the private sector and will need to work on the toughest problems that we confront. But I'm optimistic we can do this. To underscore this in a kind of dramatic way, there were those people who watched the decline of Rome or of Byzantium and caught a glimpse of the future of what was coming. And it wasn't enough to change the course of history. I think the United States can master its fate and can, with other techno-democracies, bolster and extend this model. There are immense risks if we don't do that. So it's a significant call to action for us all.
That's it for this week's podcast. I want to thank Brendan for his time. For those of you who want to go into greater depth about the things we talked about today, you can find a transcript of this show in the program notes or at our website, that's EYE-on.ai. The transcript includes relevant links to make it easier to explore the topic further. And I encourage you to download and read it, because I find you discover many things by reading that the ear misses. Let us know if you find the podcast useful and if you have suggestions about how we can improve. The singularity may not be near, but AI is about to change your world, so pay attention.
Can't get close till I buy my time.